And good evening. It's time for us to begin our class again tonight. So I'm glad to see everybody. You know, we're just about 2 weeks away from departure. So that's pretty exciting. The tickets have been mailed out, and some people have gotten theirs. Is there anybody here that's received plane tickets besides Nancy, right? And Nancy is new to our class. She's coming on tour, but she lives in Chico and has been kind of following along what we're doing. So we're glad to have you join us tonight, Nancy. Okay, so I think everybody that lives right around here in the Reading area, your tickets maybe are all coming to me. So if you haven't gotten them, don't worry. They should be here, I think, any day. And things are looking really, really good. Just before I came to class tonight, I logged onto the internet and saw that our tour guide, who is leading a tour there right now, Malcolm, posted some pictures from Gouvrine, which is in the Schwela, and they are the Bell Caves. And we'll be there in a few weeks. So they're very, very interesting places down in the southern part of Israel where limestone was mined out of the ground for use in building. And as they dug down, they continued digging, and they made these huge man-made caves, caverns that you can actually go into now. And it's quite an amazing thing. So as I was looking at it, I was thinking, wow, we're going to be there just in a few weeks' time. So we're looking forward to that. So glad you can be with us tonight. We're going to get started here in just a moment, but let's pray together first, okay? Father in heaven, we thank you tonight that we can meet like this. Thank you for all these faces that are becoming more and more familiar to each other. We look forward to spending time with each other in the Holy Land. But tonight, Lord, we pray that you would prepare our minds and our hearts in a way that will be helpful and uplifting to us. And we pray that as we prepare for this adventure of a lifetime, that you would receive the glory, the honor, and the praise, and that through our time spent studying your word and studying the land of your word, that we would come to know the God of the word more intimately and closely, and come to appreciate and admire and worship you more deeply and more meaningfully. So towards that end, we pray for the leading and the ministry of your Holy Spirit among us tonight to teach us, to lead us into all the truth. We pray these things in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so tonight we are going to be picking up where we left off last week. Last week, if you remember, we had just kind of gotten to the Dead Sea. And we're going to talk about the Dead Sea, and I mentioned at the end of class that we would start at that point when we come back. So I think we're looking at page 26 in your booklets, if you have that. But everybody should now have a sheet of review questions. So let's just take a look at these and preview where we're going to go. We are going to start out just talking about the Dead Sea a little bit, and then we're going to be talking about Jericho. So you should be able to locate on a map Jericho. And remember, the map is in the front of your booklet, but Jericho is just at the very north end of the Dead Sea. If you go directly east from Jerusalem, you will hit Jericho. So if you remember the story about the Good Samaritan, it says there was a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So Jerusalem is up at the top of the Judean mountains, and so it's quite high. Jericho, down at the north end of the Dead Sea, is way below sea level, almost at the lowest point on the earth. So when it says he was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, that's not, no kidding. That's really going down. And it goes downhill fast. We'll be up and down that highway, fortunately with the aid of a bus. We won't have to walk like the poor man in the parable. But Jericho, so that's where that is. Lachish, we will mention. We're not going to visit Lachish, but I mention it because it was a major city of Judah, south of Jerusalem, up in the Judean mountains. Lachish was conquered by the Assyrians when Hezekiah was king. So we will be talking about Hezekiah's tunnel. I heard some people discussing Hezekiah's tunnel a little bit just before we started class. When Hezekiah was digging the tunnel to protect Jerusalem, from the Assyrians, all of Judah was threatened. Well, Lachish fell, and we have archaeological, extra-biblical evidence of the fall of Lachish. And so we'll mention Lachish, and it is an important biblical city, and important archaeologically, and in terms of our understanding what's going on. Ashkelon now. For Ashkelon, we're going to move over to the Mediterranean coast. Ashkelon is south of Jaffa, and actually Ashkelon was one of the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis. Pentapolis, Penta, 5 polis cities. 5 cities of the Philistines. Today, Ashkelon is an Israelite city, but it's just north of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip down there at the south end of Israel is traditionally the area where the Philistines lived. And Ashkelon was about their northernmost settlement. Now, there were times when the Philistines expanded beyond that strip of land. And they were even as far up as the Jezreel Valley at times and had control of Beit Shean. But for the most part, the Philistine extent was along that strip, the southern part of Israel, down by the Mediterranean, and Ashkelon was their northernmost city. The other cities further south today in modern Israel are actually part of the Gaza Strip, or under control of Hamas, which is basically a Palestinian terrorist organization. But Hamas made tons and tons of promises to the Palestinian people living down in Gaza, and they elected them their rulers. So as a result, unfortunately, the people of Gaza live in a prison. Their rulers have been sent money from all the nations of the world to help their society, and instead they've used it to build terrorist tunnels, to build bombs and rockets. And this is what's going on down there in Gaza. But Ashkelon is north of the present-day Gaza Strip. It is part of Israel. We'll have a chance probably to visit Ashkelon. And it's a very interesting site. We'll talk a little bit about it tonight. I have some pictures I want to show you. And then we're going to finish up way down in the south at Be'er-Sheva. We mentioned it in the first lecture. This marks the southernmost extent of habitable Israel. So we have that expression that we talked about before, from Dan to Beersheba. Dan up in the north, Beersheba down in the south. So Beersheba is known by some as the city of the patriarchs. And we'll talk about the connection of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to Beersheba. They're also very tightly associated with Hebron for a different reason. They lived in Beersheba, but they were buried in Hebron. So these two cities are associated with the biblical patriarchs. Now, as for some of the questions we're talking about, Jericho marked the border between which 2 tribes? And we'll talk about that. Third, what New Testament event is reputed to have taken place at Karantel? Karantel. The spelling looks odd because in English we almost always follow the letter Q with a U. But the Q here represents a Hebrew letter, the letter Kof, which is not necessarily always followed by a U. So the Q is pronounced more or less like our K. So Karantal, and maybe you're wondering, what in the world is Karantal and where is it? We'll talk about that when we get there. What Old Testament hero won a great victory at the Valley of Elah? The Valley of Elah. I have a short video clip that has been made. Get back where it's range the microphone for the sake of those watching. I have a short video clip about a site that's up at the head of the Valley of Elah, and you'll find that very interesting. I'll show that when we get to that point in the lecture tonight. Talked about Lachish. So the question is, when was Lachish settled, and who was the Assyrian king who laid siege to Lachish and captured it? Number 7, what people lived in Ashkelon in the Old Testament? I actually already answered that question, but we'll mention it again when we get there. 8, what famous individual from early New Testament era was born at Ashkelon? So Ashkelon figures in both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We'll talk about this famous individual from the early New Testament era that was born in Ashkelon. Okay, we mentioned Beersheba, the city of the patriarchs. So here's the question: which Jewish patriarch or Jewish patriarchs is or are associated with Beersheba? And lastly, of what region is Beersheba now the capital? So that's what we want to talk about tonight. And I am going to, okay, let me come down here to the Dead Sea. Okay, there's Masada. There's the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea. So this graphic shows you the Dead Sea as if it didn't have any water in it. And what you can see here is that up here at this north end, it's very deep. Okay, you can see how these contours come down. Down at the south end, it's very shallow. Now, in biblical times, the Dead Sea looks just like this. It doesn't look really like this anymore, but there is a peninsula that sticks into the shallow end down at the south end here, from the Jordanian side. This peninsula has a name, and it's called the tongue. It's the Hebrew word, but it means the tongue, because it's shaped like a tongue, okay? So, well, you have to use your imagination. Okay. This was a peninsula that reached in here like this. Now, we've mentioned the fact that the Dead Sea has been drying up. I think in the first lecture we talked about that. And that's due to evaporation, because there's no outlet, but water evaporates. It's very hot down here. And then water being diverted out of the Jordan River, which is the main source of water for the Dead Sea, water being diverted out of that for agricultural purposes by both Jordan and Israel. And then in addition to that, right now Israel is in about a 6-year drought period. Praise God, they've been getting fairly good rainfall this rainy season. And I think it's raining there right now, or has rained recently. There's rain in the forecast for this coming week. And so we hope they get 2 more good weeks of rain, and then that it stops. Well, we'll see what happens. But at any rate, as the Dead Sea has been drying up, and you can see it's very shallow here, this peninsula then extended all the way across, forming 2 bodies of water. And that's what you have in the Dead Sea today. In fact, the southern body of water is almost non-existent today. There is water here, and there's enough water to get in. Our hotel is actually down here in the southern part, where we'll be spending the first couple of nights in Israel. And you'll see there's enough water there that you can get out in it, but you'll be able to see across. You'll see big flats and big berms that have been built across the Dead Sea down there. You can actually get up on one of the berms and actually walk across to Jordan. You don't want to try, but physically could do that. Lots and lots of minerals have been mined from the southern part of the Dead Sea. So there's a company, the Dead Sea Works, that mines potash is one of the chemicals. They can pull a lot of potash out of the Dead Sea. Obviously salt and a number of other minerals. Helen.
Where is the bitumen coming from?
Okay. So let me come to that. And Hallie just asked about the bitumen. So if you look in your booklets here, notice right at the very top, this is Roman numeral 25 XXV, Dead Sea. Other names for it are the Salt Sea, and it's called the Salt Sea because of the high concentration of salt and other minerals in it. So, in fact, that's actually the name given to it in the Bible in Genesis 14:3. So, Yam Melach. Yam means sea. Melach is the Hebrew word for salt. Yam Melach. And then it's called the Eastern Sea because the Western Sea would be the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Sea is the sea on the eastern side of Israel. Okay? So makes sense in Ezekiel 47:18. It's also called the Sea of the Arava. So Arava refers to the southern region of Israel, and down the Arava is also where Beersheba is located. There's a desert of the Arava, but this is called the Sea of the Arava in Deuteronomy 4:49. But notice the last thing in the parentheses here is it's called Asphaltis. That's the Latin name for this sea, Asphaltis, and obviously our word asphalt comes from that. What is asphalt? Well, asphalt is bitumen. Bitumen and asphalt are the same thing, and so it's a naturally occurring petroleum product that is kind of thick, gooey, and sticky. So Holly's question is, where did that bitumen come from? I think I have a reference in here somewhere to bitumen in the notes, one of the points. Is it point 8? No, 9. Bitumen, asphalt, occurs naturally and can be seen floating on the surface. So where does it come from? It comes from the floor of the sea. It comes up through the earth. So it's naturally occurring petroleum that oozes out of the ground. And there are even places around the Dead Sea on dry ground where from place to place you can find this.
I was reading in Genesis, it was talking about bitumen pits.
Yes.
People fell into.
Yeah. So in Genesis, there's a record of when Abraham went to rescue Lot. And in that war, the 5 kings against the 4 kings, you have some of them falling into bitumen pits. And this is the same substance, and it was occurring outside of the Dead Sea, but it oozes up through the ground. So if the ground happens to be here, in this part, then it's coming up and it's going to float on the surface of the water. Coming up over here on the surface, then it's going to ooze up and kind of make a bitumen pit that you don't want to fall into. Okay. You've all heard of the La Brea tar pits. Same thing, same phenomenon. That tar is bitumen. One of the largest bitumen locations is up in Canada. And I forget the name of it right now, but there's a very, very large geographical area that is full of all kinds of bitumen up in Canada. And it can be used for fuel. It can be burned. Over in Mesopotamia, at Babel, remember the Tower of Babel? They used bitumen for mortar in building the Tower of Babel. Same substance. So it occurs really in many, many places in the world. But here in the Dead Sea, it can be seen at times. I've never seen a chunk of it, but I've seen pictures, and I've heard that you can see it from time to time floating. I'll tell you this: when you get into the Dead Sea, and float around for a while and have whatever fun you're going to have there, and then get out, you kind of feel oily, and so there's an oily feel to that water. It's probably due to this bitumen. Okay. So thanks for asking that question. That led right into some of the discussion about the Dead Sea. So bitumen is one of the things there. Salt, of course, is another thing. And if you look at some of these pictures, notice this. Here is mineral-encrusted rocks. Here's where water has been up on the rocks, and the water has evaporated and left behind this salty mineral encrustation. Here is just where it's really on the surface of the water, basically. The very, very shallow part, water has evaporated, that's salt and minerals and so forth. And you can see places like this. It's really a pretty amazing thing to see. Here's the southern part. I was talking to you about these berms that go out across the Dead Sea. And this was taken several years ago. This was before it got quite as shallow as it is today. It's shallower than this now. But that's how they've got it divided up into these evaporation ponds to make it easier to mine the minerals. But this was, until recently, this was one of the major natural resources that Israel had, was its mining of the Dead Sea. In more recent times, their major natural resource now has become natural gas. So they have these offshore gas fields up off the northern Mediterranean coast in territory that, well, Israel discovered these natural gases, and then Lebanon said, oh, no, you've got the boundary wrong. That's in our property. And Israel said, no, there's no way. So they went and did careful measurements, and it is in Israel's territory. And there are several of these gas fields. Israel today is building a pipeline to Crete, and then from Crete to Greece. And they are probably going to become one of the major natural gas exporters in the world. And this will make life quite interesting in Europe if Israel starts supplying natural gas to the European countries, because today the major supplier is Russia. So this is kind of like Israel horning in on Russia's big business. And so they will make things quite interesting politically for Israel. And we'll see where that goes. But the agreements have been signed. They're ready to start, in about a year from now, start pumping gas to Europe. Okay, let me see if we have anything else here. Oh, yeah. So another thing in the Dead Sea is the mud from the base of the Dead Sea is actually exported as a beauty treatment. And so you can buy Dead Sea mud. You can buy it all over the world. And so you can plaster it all over yourself and then wash yourself off, and you are supposed to become beautiful. And it's reputed to have all kinds of beneficial health benefits because of all the minerals that are in it. So there are places, all over the world where people soak in these mineral baths. And so this is like an intensification of the mineral substances. And because of the high concentration of minerals, the Dead Sea is very buoyant. And this fellow's just floating on his back. He's not sitting on the bottom. He's just floating on his back. He doesn't have to struggle or anything to stay afloat. You just float like a cork. And it's warm. It's very nice. Yeah. This is down in the south, very warm part of Israel, and especially like down in the south here, it's shallow. It never gets really very cold down by the Dead Sea. Last time we were there, we actually had a rainfall, which is almost unheard of. It almost never rains. Sun shines all the time. It's warm. It's kind of like Palm Springs or something like that, I guess. So, yeah. And then we're going to talk about Qumran next. But before we talk about Qumran, let me just make sure we hit all the points I wanted to hit here. We've already mentioned a number of times that the Dead Sea is the lowest place on the surface of the earth, about 1,400 feet below sea level. That's point number 3 in your notes. How highly concentrated is the Dead Sea? About 25% mineral content. That's 1 part out of every 4 is solid. Okay, except it's in suspension or in solution, and but it makes for a very dense water that you float on. Bitumen occurs naturally, as we said. Here's some of the minerals there. Notice the list in point number 8: salt, potash, magnesium, calcium chloride, and bromide. So all of these have been mined out of the Dead Sea and used sometimes for whatever chemical reasons. Some of these are good for fertilizer, yeah, and for other things. Number 10, a hill of salt at the southwest corner, not too far from where our hotel is, has eroded into strange forms, including pillars, which are known as Lot's wife by the local Arabs. Okay, so what happened to Lot's wife? She looked back when she was told not to, and she turned into a pillar of salt. So you've got these pillars there that are very salty, and the Arabs, recalling this account from the Bible, said, "Oh, that's Lot's wife." If that was Lot's wife, she's pretty big girl, because it could be huge things. in Old Testament times, the sea formed a natural barrier between Judah on the west, Moab and Edom on the east. So we read about the Moabites and the Edomites. Okay, so these were descended from Lot. Remember, Lot's daughters had children by questionable means. So these were Moab and Edom, and they settled on the east side of the Dead Sea. Okay, and number 12, an interesting prophecy occurs in Ezekiel 47, and something similar to it in Zechariah 14, verse 8. During the millennial kingdom, the Dead Sea will be transformed into a freshwater lake, fed by a stream that will flow from Jerusalem, and will be a rich source of fish, according to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel and Zechariah talks about this river that flows out of the temple in the kingdom. And the river comes out of the temple, splits into two, one half going west towards the Mediterranean, the other half going east down towards the Dead Sea. And that water flowing out of the temple in Jerusalem will replenish the Dead Sea. And Ezekiel says it will be teeming with fish. Today, nothing lives in the Dead Sea. It's called the Dead Sea because nothing lives there. It just can't. It's too salty. But in the kingdom, it will be utterly transformed. Okay, so any questions? I want to show you a brief video clip. Oh, we talked about Masada last time. Here's a nice picture of Masada, by the way. This is the north end of Masada. And at the north end is Herod's palace. So there's the top level. That steps down, here's another level. Steps down, here's another level. This is at that north end where it would catch the prevailing winds out of the north. And as we were just saying, down by the Dead Sea, it's warm. It's warm most of the time. But if you wanted to have a palace, you wanted to build it in a place where it would catch that natural cooling from the winds coming down from the north. And that's it. But I thought this was such a nice picture. I wanted to show that to you. Okay. There is also, I want to show a video clip. Before we do that, I want to show you this picture. Well, it's not really a picture, but this is an article that appeared last year in National Geographic about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody's heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Okay, so discovered actually just before the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have the oldest copies of the Bible that are known. And not only of the Bible, but there are other writings. Some of them were commentaries, some of them were religious writings related, we think, to the sect down by Qumran. We're going to talk about Qumran in just a few moments. But there were 11 caves that were found to contain scrolls. And just in the last couple of years, there was a 12th cave discovered that was deemed to be a Dead Sea Scroll cave. Now, they didn't find any scrolls. They did find a scroll that had not been written on. It was blank. They found some broken pottery, and they found evidence of looters having been in the cave. So it's being classified as a 12th Dead Sea Scroll cave, even though we don't have any written scrolls on it. But this is a good article here. Archaeologists uncovered this 2,000-year-old parchment. This is right here. In a newly discovered cave near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Let me show you the whole scroll. So again, this is just a parchment they believe had been prepared for writing, but had not been had anything recorded on it yet. That was all recovered. We are going to have this year at the Alpha Omega Conference coming up in April, Dr. Randall Price, who has been excavating in this very site. And he was just back there just a few weeks ago also, and I haven't seen any official recordings of what he found on this visit, but we'll be able to hear during Alpha Omega. So, and you can read this article. It's from February 10th, 2017, okay, a couple of years ago. Let me see if there's anything any other pictures here that are good. Here's what the hillside looks like, and this hillside is actually riddled with caves. There's some of the broken pottery that was discovered. There are some archaeologists there inside the cave looking around, trying to find what they can. So you can go there and read all about it. It's National Geographic, February, 2 years ago, 2017. Okay, I want to, away from here, I want to get to this video clip here. Now this is a nice video clip. This is a good aerial tour of the land of Israel. It's going to show all over Israel, but it's got some very nice pictures of some of the areas that we're going to be talking about tonight as well. So I'm going to play that for you now.
How should we approach Jerusalem? A city which for thousands of years has been regarded as the center of the world.
That's the Mediterranean coast, looking at Caesarea or Caesarea. There's the aqueduct built by Herod the Great.
From the west, we cross the Mediterranean Sea
Jaffa.
to port cities once governed by Egyptians, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans. From the north, we follow the River Jordan to the Sea of Galilee. Here, on these shores, a teacher known as Jesus of Nazareth preached in the synagogue of the village of Capernaum.
There's the synagogue we
And
talked
found
about
his first
there in
convert
Capernaum.
among the local fishermen.
Okay, there's the Dead Sea.
From the east, the Israelites, and later the tribes of Arabia, traversed the Judean desert and the Dead Sea.
The background, the mountains of Judea. Dead Sea.
The lowest point on Earth has yielded some of the most astonishing archaeological finds of all time.
Here's
From the
Masada.
Dead Sea Scrolls to King Herod's palace fortress, Masada. It was here, after the destruction of Jerusalem, that a group of Jewish rebels made their last stand against the Roman army. Along the eastern road to Jerusalem, early Christian hermits seeking solitude in the desert.
Okay, let me just point this out. Now, we're down by the Dead Sea. We're now moving up between Jerusalem and Jericho. Okay, there's a deep cavern here, a deep canyon, and monks built this monastery way out in the middle of nowhere on the side of this canyon. And that was so that they could find solitude and peace and get away from the world and everything else. But look at how they had to build that thing. And this was in the early Middle Ages. They didn't have modern construction equipment. It's just amazing. So you're looking from the Jerusalem side down this canyon past this monastery, and just beyond sight here is the city of Jericho.
build remote monasteries, some inhabited for over 1,500 years. When we reach Jerusalem,
Now, I want to stop this right here to point out something we've talked about. Here's Jerusalem. Here's the Dome of the Rock. Okay? This is the top of the Mount of Olives. Look at how deep this valley is. That's the Kidron Valley. Okay? And I mentioned that if you were standing on top of the Mount of Olives, you look right down into the temple in biblical days, where the Dome of the Rock is. And you can see that. Here's Mount of Olives, it's higher. Prophets say, Isaiah says, that in the kingdom, Mount Zion will be exalted above the mountains. So tremendous geological changes will be taking place in the kingdom at the second coming of Christ. But this is what it looks like today. This is a great, great aerial shot of this.
which of its 7 gates shall we enter? How shall we navigate its tangled alleyways, shaped by centuries of processions converging on its holy sites? The church in time, to a land steeped where Jesus was crucified and resurrected, whose grey dome.
Here, okay, this kind of blue gray dome building here. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, and kind of here's the Dome of the Rock. Can't see the top of it, but that's the base of the Dome of the Rock. So here's Temple Mount, and across the way here, Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Out this way would be the northern gate, where the alternate site for the crucifixion of Christ, the garden tomb, is found. Okay, so there's some question about where was Jesus crucified. It's difficult to say. At the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, kind of up in here, is Antonia Fortress, where the Via Dolorosa begins. Okay, so he comes from the site either down to here, or he comes from this site over to here, or some other place if it was somewhere else. We don't know for sure. But that's, yeah, Temple Mount and Church of the Holy Sepulchre, probably the two most well-known places in the old city of Jerusalem.
Stones mark the place where many Christians believe Jesus was crucified and resurrected. The massive 2,000-year-old stone platform with its venerated western wall. For Jews, it is where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son, and Solomon built the first Jewish temple. The top of the stone platform is home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad was taken in a miraculous night journey and ascended to heaven. Travel back in time to a land steeped in layers of history, cherished as the birthplace of monotheism. Explore this crossroads of the world through the stories of people who call it home. discover a city that continues to stir the imagination of billions of people. And find out why Jerusalem remains the beating heart of our world today.
Okay. Did you like that? That was good. That was a really well done video, I thought.
Dr. Gunn?
Yeah.
What's the population of Jerusalem today?
I don't know. That's a good question. You can Google it and find out. Well, it's also a complicated question. This isn't going to help me answer it, but you know, there's East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem. So that's one division. So are you talking about combined East and West Jerusalem, or are you talking about one or the other? If you're talking about East Jerusalem, there's also all of East Jerusalem, but that portion of East Jerusalem is the old city within those city walls. So you can talk about the population of Old City, or you can talk about the population of East Jerusalem, or you can talk about the population of East and West Jerusalem, or you could talk about the greater Jerusalem area, which would take in various suburbs. So that's the complication, but obviously it's the capital of the country. What's the population of Israel? It's like 6 million. But I don't, off the top of my head, I can't tell you what the population of Jerusalem is. That's a good question, a legitimate question, one your professor should be able to answer. But I would just Google it to find out. Yeah.
It's just under 900,000.
Just under 900,000. Thank you. Okay.
So whatever that's in 2015.
2015. And, okay. All right. Any other questions at this point? Okay, let's push on a little bit farther here. We're going to come back to our presentation. So now we were down at the Dead Sea, and as we travel north up along the western shore of the Dead Sea, at the north end is a place called Qumran. Qumran. Now, I had up here that National Geographic article about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Qumran lies down at the base of the cliffs where the Dead Sea Scrolls are located. So the caves themselves are up in a cliff. And at the base of that, it's flat, more or less, where as you approach the north end of the Dead Sea. And there in that flat plain is this settlement. The name of the settlement is Qumran. And there was something that was there, and scholars are of different opinions about what was there in biblical times. Most believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls were produced at Qumran. But some scholars differ, and they take a different approach. One other alternate view is that this was a pottery factory. And there's some evidence that may suggest that. Others think that there was a Roman garrison stationed here. And the truth may be a combination of these things. It may have been one settlement that was used for different purposes at different times. But we can learn quite a number of interesting things. If you'll notice in your booklet on page 27, Qumran, located at the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. Now, we don't know what the city of salt in Joshua 15:62 is, but some have speculated this might be Qumran. It wasn't Jericho, because Jericho was well known, it had a name, so it's some city in this region that was the city of salt, and this is a likely candidate. In the 1st century, it was a major site for the Essene community. So let's talk about the Essenes for just a moment. We never read about the Essenes in the Bible. The name just does not occur. But we do know about the Essenes from Josephus and from other writings of this era, the first century. What we know in the Bible is that there were various sects of Judaism. So we read about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. Those are the three major sects in New Testament times. The Essenes were another sect, and Josephus talks about them. They were a sect of celibates. They did not marry. They were very stringent in their rules. Many of them lived as hermits. Some of them lived in communities and communes. There was an Essene quarter of Jerusalem in New Testament times, and that was at the southwest corner of Jerusalem, was the Essene quarter. The Essenes had their own views. They were distrustful of the priesthood, and that may have stemmed from some of the, well, let's call it what it is, some of the shenanigans that were going on during the intertestamental period on the part of the Hasmoneans. We talked about the Hasmoneans. These were the descendants of the Maccabees, who liberated Jerusalem from the Greeks. And they dedicated the temple, and this is the origin of Hanukkah. And these became rulers in Israel in the intertestamental era, but the rulers were very, well, some would say incompetent, some would say they were tyrannical. They were, even though they were from the priestly tribe, they weren't very godly or holy people. And so the Pharisees had a big conflict with the Hasmoneans, and the Hasmoneans ended up putting thousands of Pharisees to death. This seems to be where the sect of the Pharisees arose, and they may have arisen because the Hasmoneans were from the tribe of Levi. They shouldn't have been kings anyway, because the scepter shall not depart from Judah, says the prophecy in Genesis. The Pharisees initially were those that stood for the truth of the Bible in the face of apostasy. And so you and I, as Christians who are steeped in our understanding of the New Testament, think of the Pharisees as the bad guys, because they're the ones that always have this confrontation with Jesus. But the Pharisees originally were the guys that were standing up for biblical truth. Now the problem was they added to the Bible the traditions of their elders. And this was the main point that Jesus had a conflict with them over. Can you take the tradition of your religious teachers and make that the equivalent with the Word of God? Jesus said no. So you have the Hasmoneans. Their descendants became what the New Testament calls the Sadducees. So that gives you Sadducees, descended from the Hasmoneans. Once their rule was taken away from them by Herod the Great, they became the Sadducee sect. Then you have the Pharisees. Okay, the Herodians were the group of Israelites that thought, you know what, we're Jews, we're living here, we're in the Roman Empire, the Romans are letting us carry out our religious function without interference, so that's fine with us. We're supportive of Rome and of their appointed ruler, who was Herod. So they were called the Herodians. So we have Sadducees, Pharisees, and Herodians. The Essenes were a fourth sect. The Essenes did not trust the priests. Because they didn't trust the priests, they did not believe that Jerusalem was a suitable place to worship God. So they forsook the temple. The temple, in their mind, was defiled. They didn't want to have anything to do with the Jerusalem temple. One of the scrolls that was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a very large and very intricate description, is called the Temple Scroll. And it was a set of instructions that the Essenes had for building a temple. And it was a magnificent temple. But it was to replace or to be used instead of the Jerusalem temple, because they were not in favor of the Jerusalem temple. So So the Temple Scroll, the Essenes. One theory, and it's only a theory, there's no way to prove this, but one theory is that John the Baptist, in the years of his development and growing up, was actually a member of the Essene community at Qumran. Now, I don't favor that theory myself, but there are many people who support that theory. And there is evidence from the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of John the Baptist that they shared some ideas in common with the Essenes. Now, that doesn't mean that they learned it from the Essenes. It might simply be that the Essenes happened to stumble upon some truths and that Jesus and John the Baptist were uttering these same truths. It doesn't prove any connection between them. But there are some similarities between some of Jesus's teaching and John's teaching with the Essenes. So the Essenes had this place down here by Qumran, and what we're looking at here is known as the scriptorium. A scriptorium would be a place that was set aside for the purpose of copying scriptures or copying scrolls. So if the Essenes were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, this would be the area where those scrolls were created initially. Now, not everybody buys that theory. Some people think that the scrolls were brought there from Jerusalem or from some other place and hid in the caves in order to protect them from the Romans. But the most prevalent theory is they're produced here at Qumran. And you'll see the note down at the bottom here, because of inkwells and writing benches found in this room, it's been named the scriptorium, where it is supposed the scrolls were copied. And here is one of the inkwells that was discovered here at Qumran. So this would have just been a vessel for holding ink, and a scribe would have had that. In a scriptorium, the practice was to have scribes sitting at desks, and in the front, a lector or a reader who would read from his manuscript, and the scribes would copy down what they're hearing. Okay, that's one way in ancient times of mass producing documents before the invention of printing presses. Now, the other way was much slower, but a little more accurate, and that was to have one scribe have the original, and he looks at the original and then copies some words and looks back, copies some more words, looks back, copies some more words. In a scriptorium where you have a lector reading, you tend to have errors showing up in the manuscripts that are based on hearing. So words that are sound alike. You hear one word and you think you know what it is and you write it down, but really the person reading meant a different word. And this shows up in some of the New Testament manuscripts as well. Now, not saying the New Testament manuscripts are made at Qumran, but the same kind of practice. When you have a single scribe writing from an original to a copy, you have a different kind of error that shows up in some of the manuscripts, and these are errors of memory. Because you read a certain amount. How much do you read? Maybe a sentence, a couple of sentences. How much can you retain in your mind? So you read maybe a couple of sentences, and you come over here and you write them down. And then you look back and you pick up where you left off. But now, what if you forgot? And what if you backed up and you read the last part of what you read before, and then that gets copied a second time in your manuscript? Or the opposite, you come back and you think you left off here, but really you left off a little bit earlier. So you read the next part, and then something gets left out. And we find all these kinds of errors in various New Testament manuscripts that comes from the practice of the various practices of copying scrolls. But here's an inkwell used by a scribe to dip his quill into as he copies. Now, as we mentioned, this is down in the Syrian-African Rift Valley. It is a geologically very, very active fault area, and it is well known for many earthquakes over the years. So here is a staircase leading down into a mikveh. A mikveh, again, is a place for ritual bathing, okay, full immersion. And there are a number of mikvaot, that's the plural of mikveh, number of mikvaot down at Qumran. This is one of them, but look at what happened in the earthquake. It split the staircase right in two, right down the middle. And it was that violent of an earthquake. It actually split this, and you can see a gap in there of maybe a couple of feet, nearly 12 inches, it says. So these steps leading down into a mikveh were damaged by the earthquake of 31 BC, separating the left side from the right side by nearly 12 inches. And then, since it's down here by the Dead Sea, which almost never gets any rain, what are you going to do for water? You can't go down to the Dead Sea and draw water because you can't drink that stuff, okay? So what happens down here by the Dead Sea is you're at the base of the Judean mountains. Up in the Judean mountains, it rains. And when it rains, water begins to flow down. It comes down these valleys in big flash floods. And to this day, flash floods in this area are a very dangerous thing. Every year you read about some hikers that get caught in a canyon and are killed or have to be rescued because of a flash flood. And so what happens is you've got a storm going on up in the mountains, and you're down here where it's sunny and hot and dry, and maybe you notice some clouds up there, maybe you don't notice the clouds, you're just ignorant, you're not thinking about anything. All of a sudden, here comes this massive wall of water down the canyon. You have no way to go. And the water is carrying with it rocks and debris and who knows, all kinds of stuff. And if you get caught in that, I mean, you're pretty much gone. It comes down sometimes and washes out the highway down alongside the west side of the Dead Sea, and they have to do repairs to the highway. Just this last, I think it was last year in the winter, there was a tourist bus down there that had to be rescued. There were tourists stranded on this bus, and it was out in the middle of all this water, and they had to send a rescue party out there to get them out. Well, in Qumran, they built quite a cistern system. So what we're looking at in this picture are holding tanks to collect the water. When there comes water cascading down, they channeled it so that it would come and collect in these big pools. So these were lined so that they would hold water, and they had a good amount of water, as long as they were careful to collect the water whenever it would come down through the canyon. So due to scarcity of water, rainwater was channeled into a system of 8 very large cisterns connected by a series of channels, and that's there at Qumran. Now here's a picture of some of the caves. This is actually the most famous cave. There were more scrolls found in this cave than any of them. This is cave number 4 at Qumran. And we'll be able to see this when we visit Qumran. We won't be able to go into the cave. We'll be on the same side of this canyon as this picture is taken, but you can see right across to it, almost this exact same shot right here. But over 40,000 fragments were discovered right in this cave. And there it is, right in the middle of that cliff. You'd wonder how in the world did they get in there. Apparently you get in from above. You'd have to have a rope and then maybe climb back up out of the rope. Otherwise, I mean, you couldn't really climb up this steep cliff. So how they got into some of these caves is still something of an enigma. Some of them are this 12th cave we were talking about earlier is in a very difficult place to access. And if you come to Alpha Omega in April, I'm sure that Dr. Price will be talking about his activities at that 12th cave. Okay, that's Qumran. I want to move now to Jericho, just up a little ways from Qumran, not very far. Qumran and Jericho are fairly close to each other. So Qumran is right down alongside the Dead Sea. Jericho is north of the north end of the Dead Sea. Jericho is one of the oldest cities in the world. Sometimes it's wrongly called the oldest city in the world. Okay, there are some older cities, but it is certainly a very, very ancient city. Notice question number 1 is the answer to one of our questions. Show on a map the location of Jericho. and it's located about 10 miles northwest of the mouth of the Jordan at the Dead Sea. And already at Jericho, you're 825 feet below sea level. That's way down there, way, way down there. Now, just to make life interesting and confusing, when you read about Jericho, you have to keep in mind there are two Jerichos. There's an Old Testament Jericho, and there's a New Testament Jericho. And then in addition to that, there's a modern city of Jericho, which is different yet. Now, they're all right next to each other, but there is a definite demarcation between these sites. And so the Tell, which is Old Testament Jericho, and we will probably go up to the Tell and see the excavations there on our tour, is located about 1.25 miles northwest of the modern city. Okay. So again, a Tell is a mound. It's been built up over the years. A civilization built upon civilization, built upon civilization. So when we go to the Tell, we drive up and we get out in the parking lot, and then it's a little hike up to get up to the Tell, and then we can see the excavations. Tell Jericho was first excavated by Kathleen Kenyon, and then there have been a number of other excavations since hers. New Testament Jericho, okay, so number 2, the Tell, that's Old Testament Jericho. New Testament Jericho is represented by another Tell slightly south of Old Testament Jericho. So in one account in the Gospels, you read about Jesus healing a blind man. In one account, it says he was leaving Jericho when he healed him. In another account, it says he was entering Jericho when he healed the blind man. And skeptics say, see, there's a contradiction in the Bible. And it's not a contradiction at all. It's simply that he was leaving one Jericho and entering the other one. Because we're New Testament, okay? Old Testament Jericho was still there. So he had gone through one and was entering the other one, and that was where he healed this blind man. And that's all there is to it. Like most of the arguments that the skeptics bring up against the Bible, it's simply due to their own ignorance that they think there is a contradiction. Number 4, it's known as the city of palm trees in Deuteronomy 34, Judges 1, Judges 3, and so forth. As we know, Joshua sent 2 spies to spy out the city of Jericho. And they were taken care of by Rahab. Rahab, either the harlot or the innkeeper. And the word could mean either. And it's not certain. Most of our Bibles say harlot. She's got a bad reputation, yeah. But the same word can mean an innkeeper. And so you read it whichever way you want to. Okay, the fall of Jericho is recorded in Joshua 6 by a miracle of God as they marched around the city, and all in silence, day after day, and finally, the last day they marched around 7 times, blew their horns, and the walls came down. The city was cursed by Joshua. That curse was fulfilled in 1 Kings 16:34 with regards to whoever rebuilds Jericho. Okay. Now, here's another question that we have in our review sheet. Question number 2, Jericho marked the border between which 2 tribes? Okay, so down here it is the border between Ephraim and Benjamin. So to the north of Jericho was the territory given to Ephraim, and to the south was Benjamin, or Benjamin. So Benjamin, the tribe from which King Saul came, and later on another Saul in the New Testament, known as the Apostle Paul, also from the tribe of Benjamin. The 2 biblical Sauls coming from the tribe of Benjamin. Ephraim, of course, remember Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so his 2 sons were taken by Jacob as his own sons. And they were given inheritance in the land. So you have a tribe of Ephraim and a tribe of Manasseh. These are the 2 sons of Joseph. So Joseph actually became 2 tribes, whereas the rest of the sons were 1 tribe each. But the border between Ephraim and Benjamin was right there at Jericho. Okay, we have several other references to Jericho here. I'm not going to read through all of those. If there's anything I want to mention, Point number 15, you might notice, New Testament Jericho was built by Herod the Great. And we talk a lot about the building projects of Herod the Great. He built all over the land of Israel, magnificent building projects. And one of them was New Testament Jericho. The healing of Bartimaeus occurred in Jericho. The story of Zacchaeus. Okay, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. He climbed in a sycamore tree, right? We all sang that song in Sunday school. And that is the place we're talking about. Now, in 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, Jericho also fell to the Romans in a fierce battle in which Jews tried to destroy the valuable balsam trees. And then later, in the 4th century and on during the Byzantine period, remember the Byzantines were the Christian Romans after Rome accepted Christianity as a manner, in a way. It was the Byzantine Empire, and during this time there were several churches and monasteries built in Jericho for obvious reasons. It was a very important biblical city. So here's an aerial view of Jericho, and we're looking here at the tell of Old Testament Jericho right here. Okay. Here is a sycamore fig tree in the modern city of Jericho, and it is, they'll tell you it was Zacchaeus' tree, okay, but it's in the wrong city, the modern city. But that's all right. People like to get out there and have their picture taken in front of Zacchaeus' tree, and it makes a nice picture. But that's a very old and very large sycamore tree. Yeah. Okay. That is Jericho, and I want to talk to you about Car and Tal, but I think we're going to take a break first. And so, for those that are following on the on the live feed, we're going to take a 15-minute break. It's 10 minutes after. Okay, so I want to welcome you back to class. I said we'd start at 7:20. We're a couple of minutes late, but that's all right. We'll get going. People are filtering on into the door. And as we left off last time, I mentioned that we were going to be talking about this strange sounding place called Carantel. Carantel is up in the Judean mountains, up in the cliffs kind of, just up behind Jericho. And we were just talking about Jericho. And if you notice in your notebook on page 28, this is the Roman numeral 28, on page 28, how about that? XXVIII, that's 28. Carantel. And the name means the 40. It means 40. And this is the Mount of Temptation. This is the traditional site where they think Christ was driven into the wilderness and tempted by the devil for 40 days, 40 nights, hence the name Carantel, or 40. So as you look at this, it is indeed a very foreboding looking place. And this is a view looking west from Old Testament Jericho, looking at the Mount of Temptation. So you're down here in the valley at Jericho where there's a nice spring, lots and lots of water, lots of green, but you look up in the mountains and you don't see anything growing up there. It's very barren, very dry. And so when we read about Jesus then up in this kind of an area, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights as he is tempted by the devil, what a place to be tempted, right? They say that you can look at the temptation of Christ and contrast it with the temptation of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were in a beautiful garden with everything they needed. Pleasant atmosphere, lots of water, trees, plenty of food to eat. They had everything going for them and they fell. Christ had everything going against him. There was no water. It's harsh conditions. He was hungry. He had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. and the devil threw everything at him, and under the harshest, worst possible conditions, Christ could not fall. And that's the difference between the first Adam and the last Adam. The Lord Jesus Christ contrasted with Adam. But this is, if this is the place, and of course we don't know, this is the traditional site, but it certainly fits the description of what Christ would have faced. Now, if you look carefully up in the side of the mountain, it's almost camouflaged, you can see a monastery. And in the video clip we looked at earlier, coming down from Jerusalem through that steep canyon, remember we saw a monastery right up there in the side of the cliff. Do you see it? Okay. So it's almost impossible to imagine somebody building a monastery up in a place like that, but it was built there because it was close to the place where they thought Christ was tempted. So they believed they could go up there and deny themselves as Christ was denied, and identify with Christ and his temptations, and see if they could depend upon God and be delivered from temptation in a place where Christ himself was.
What do they call that monastery?
Okay, there's actually more than one monastery up here. This one, I think, is St. George's Monastery. Okay, that's my monastery, St. George. There's also a school on the road between our hotel and the Damascus Gate of Old Jerusalem. That's St. George's School. So I've got a school there too. Actually, St. George is very popular all throughout the Holy Land. When we go to Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity, you'll see a statue of St. George, the dragon slayer, on his horse with his javelin, his spear. The stories about St. George are quite interesting. I shouldn't go off on this, but I kind of like St. George. It's my birthday, yeah, you're right. Down by, well, close to what is Tel Aviv today, there was a settlement, and their water source became inaccessible because there was this monster that lived in the water there, a dragon. And so George was the man that slew the dragon. But that's where it took place. It was in the Holy Land, right down there by Tel Aviv. And so that's what made him well known and famous, because he made it possible for the people to go and get their water once again. But George was the one who gave his name to the country, not the state, but the country of Georgia. So nestled up there between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, you have Azerbaijan, you have Georgia, and you have, what's the other one? Tajikistan is up in that area. That's not the one I'm thinking of. Anyway, but Georgia is named after St. George, and he's the patron saint of that country. I don't know if Georgia here in the United States, I think it's named after King George. But all throughout the Middle East, you have many, many references in various places to St. George. So there's a monastery up here named after him as well. So this is up in Carentel. So bring us back on track where we're supposed to be. So if you go up here, you're looking down on the oasis of Jericho from up in Carentel, and you can just see one of the towers of that monastery right here. And look at how desolate this canyon looks. Very steep, very difficult to get to. And then we're going to go to the Valley of Elah. Let's see if there's anything else about Carentel we want to mention on our in our booklets. Located west of Jericho amid many high cliffs, which you can see on those pictures. Traditional site of the temptation. A fortress was built on the location by the Hasmoneans. We just talked about the Hasmoneans. Who were they? Descendants of the Maccabees, right. Okay, so they were these Levite rulers, Levite kings. And so there was a fortress built by the Hasmoneans at Carentel. And the name of the fortress was Dok, or Dagon. Okay, Byzantine monks founded a monastery at the site of the former Hasmonean fortress. The present monastery was built in 1887 and is inhabited by 6 Greek Orthodox monks. Okay, so that's Parental. What's that? Yeah, all right, I know. Okay, now I want to go and talk about the Valley of Ela a little bit, and after we finish talking about Ela, I want to show you a short video clip about a very exciting recent archaeological discovery associated with the Valley of Ela. But we're now moving south of Jerusalem down into the region known as the Shphelah. This is a rising, gently rising territory between the coast and the Judean mountains. It's kind of rolling hills, very, very pretty, very nice. This time of the year, or the time of the year when we're going to be like there, it's filled with lots and lots of wildflowers. As you can see in this picture here, the kind of rolling hills with little valleys in between them. Lots of nice farming country. So there was a lot going on here in the Shphelah. Nearby to the Valley of Ela is the city of Bet Shemesh. And Bet Shemesh figures into the story. Remember when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant? And they couldn't hold on to it because they kept having all these disasters happening to them. And so they finally loaded it onto a cart along with some offerings for the God of Israel. And they hitched up a couple of cows that had never been hitched before. And they set them off, and the cows went straight up towards Israel. And the Ark was received at Bet Shemesh. So this is the territory we're talking about here. Valley of Ela is not Bet Shemesh, but it's right adjacent to Bet Shemesh. At the extreme northeast end of this valley, it goes up into the mountains, and not too far from there is Bethlehem. Okay, so as I said, we're just a little bit south of Jerusalem here, and Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem. So you get your bearings here. You go from Jerusalem south to Bethlehem, go downhill, you're at the Valley of Ela. Being that close to Bethlehem, this was undoubtedly a place that was well known to David, who shepherded his father's flocks in the region of the Valley of Ela. In the Bible, we read about a great hero of the Philistines who challenged the armies of Israel. And he was a giant, and his name was Goliath. Okay, David and Goliath. This is it. This is the Valley of Ela. And we'll visit the Valley of Ela, and we'll see the place where David slew Goliath. And this is one of the places where we can say, yeah, this is it. This is where it happened. And there are really quite a few places like that where we are highly certain about the place. Other times, and we'll tell you when that is, we say, well, there's good reason to think this might be the place, and here are the reasons why, but it might not have been this place. Other times we'll say, well, this is the traditional site, but there are pretty good arguments against this big legitimate site. So there's different degrees of certainty about some of them. The Valley of Ela we know about. Here's the Ela tree. It's a type of terebinth or oak tree. So they have oak trees called the terebinth. It's a live oak, and it looks a lot. They look a lot like some of our live oaks here. And here is the little stream running down through there. David stopped at a stream and picked up 5 smooth stones. And you can see it wouldn't be hard to find 5 smooth stones in this area. And anybody know why he chose 5? Was that a lack of faith?
No, because Goliath had 4 brothers.
Goliath had 4 brothers. That's exactly right. So David said, after I take him out, I'm going to take care of his brothers. He was pretty sure his brothers would come after him, right? But they didn't. But the brothers were taken care of later. Okay, so there's the brook of Ela. Also in the Valley of Ela is where you have a biblical site called Adullam. And when David was hiding out from Saul at one point, it says he hid out in the caves of Adullam. So that's here. Earlier, last week, we saw Ein Gedi, the spring of the goat kid, and we mentioned that there are caves at Ein Gedi where David also hid out and where he cut off the skirt of Saul. Okay, so that's different location. Here's another cave, a different place. This is in the Shphelah, the valley of Elah, Adullam. So here is one such cave. Of course, you can see the stone walls have been built up around it, but it goes back into that hillside. And this, we don't know if this is the one where David hid out, but David hid at the caves of Adullam. And it was there that he asked for, he was longing for water from the well at Bethlehem. And his brave men then went to Bethlehem, got some water, and brought it to him. But he would not take it. He poured it out as an offering to the Lord. Okay, and then Lachish is going to be next. But I want to go to this. Are there any questions at this point? Any questions? I want to go to this video clip dealing with this archaeological discovery at Elah. So the modern name of this place is Khirbet Qeiyafa. Khirbet Qeiyafa, that's an Arabic name. It is believed by the archaeologist who has been excavating there that this is the location of the city of Sha'araim, which means two gates. It was a city with two gates, and that's an important part of the discussion. So let's go now to the upper edge of the valley of Elah and see what we can learn about.
3,000 years ago, a young shepherd named David walked the hilltop of Khirbet Qeiyafa, unintimidated by the taunts of Goliath, the giant whom he would later slay in the Elah valley below. After David's ascendance to the throne, this same elevation, 30 kilometers from Jerusalem, became a strategic city along the border with Israel's archenemy, the Philistines. Today, the remains of the ancient fortified city have become an archaeological dig site led by Professor Yosef Garfinkel, the Yigal Yadin Professor of Archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. During a recent press conference and field tour, Garfinkel presented his latest discoveries, sacred artifacts, evidence of Israel's devotion to God during the time of King David.
The idea that you can see that we have no human or animal figurines at all in our site. And this is in total different to Canaanite or to Philistine or Edomite or what we know of Mesopotamia and Egypt.
Unlike the motifs found on the
He is speaking English, by the way.
pagan cult objects of the same period, the absence of animal or human figurines not only strengthens the credibility of the biblical accounts of Israel's ancient religious practices, but is also evidence that the people of David's kingdom were living by these standards. The objects were discovered in special rooms within homes built directly into the walls of the city. The Holy Room was set apart, an early prototype of the Holy of Holies of Solomon's temple.
The two models that I've showed you came from this room over there, near the city gate. But let's look now at the building. You see the wall here? It's running and abutting the city wall.
The strategic positioning of these ancient rooms, both within the city walls and near the city gate, could indicate the preeminent role devotion to God factored into everyday Israeli life of 3,000 years ago. Walls and gates were prime property, places of authority and fortification, with a clear view to the advances of the enemy. Thanks to Garfinkel's work, obscure technical biblical terms apparently lost over the millennia now have new clarity. Designs etched into the sacred objects are consistent with the biblical descriptions of motifs. For example, the trig-leaf or three-leaf structure also appears on columns of Solomon's temple, and what some translations refer to as windows, now from the artifacts are clearly distinguishable as triple recessed doors, the design that appears in the biblical description of the Temple of Solomon and the heavenly temple of Ezekiel's vision. So what do the archaeological discoveries of Khirbet Qeiyafa do for the credibility of the Bible?
This would give the biblical account really true. If it was just fantasies, so you will not find the evidence in archaeology, in archaeological finds that confirm it. That's, I think, the strength of our work. I cannot ignore the biblical text, and I cannot ignore the archaeology. We need to work together.
Barney Blom, Axe News Network, Elah Valley, Israel.
Okay, so that's some pretty exciting archaeology that's going on. There's archaeology everywhere in Israel, and they say if you go to build something, you better plan on several extra years, because once you put a shovel in the ground, you're probably going to strike something of archaeological significance, and then all the work comes to a stop, and the archaeologists come in, they do their study, and then you may or may not be able to go ahead and build. So we think that the restrictions with building permits and stuff are harsh and difficult and restrictive here. Well, just be glad you're not trying to build in the land of Israel. But it's exciting too, because there's so much interesting stuff to be found. Some of it from biblical times, some of it from medieval times, Crusader, Ottoman, Byzantine. I mean, you name it. That's one of the reasons why in this class we're trying to establish these different time eras in relation to Israel. When you go there and start looking at these various sites, you want to be able to understand what it is that you're looking at. I may have shared this before, but it's worth saying again. I've had people over the years say to me, "Oh well, I don't like organized things like your organized tour. I just want to kind of go over there and just see it for myself." And I always urge people, do that, but go on an organized tour first. Because when you go there and you're looking at something, you see a bunch of stones piled up. And what is it that you're looking at? Is this 1,500 years old? Is it 2,000 years old? Is it 3,000 years old? Is it Philistine? Is it Canaanite? Is it Israelite? Is it Egyptian? What significance does it have? Is it connected to anything in the Bible, or is it connected to something else? You don't know. All you know is you're looking at a bunch of rocks. In fact, this is what will happen. I almost guarantee it. We'll go. You'll take tons of pictures, and I hope you do, because you want to be able to remember this. We'll get back, and about a couple months later, you're going to come by my office, and you're going to say, "Dr. Gunn, what is this?" What is this picture? Because you won't remember. And it just happens. It just happens. And hopefully I'll be able to tell you. If I don't know, I'll make something up.
I was Sarah Meyer about that. She recommended that I write down the name of where we are and then take a picture.
Yeah. That's a good idea. In fact, for those of you that are taking the class for credit, one of the assignments is to keep a diary, a log, a journal. And so you can incorporate that journal with your picture taking and make some kind of indications. You're taking notes, what you are, which picture numbers those are, and so forth. That can be real helpful. Okay. All right, so that's the Valley of Elah, and that's in the Shephelah Valley. So also, not too far from this location is this other city. We will not be able to visit Lachish, but I just want to say a few things about it. It's still, obviously, this is similar kind of territory, rolling hills down in, not quite the Shephelah, but we're kind of between the Judean mountains and the Shephelah here. If you look in your notebook, Lachish, a 31-acre what they'll say it's in the Shephelah. Okay, we're 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, surrounded on three sides by Nahal Lachish. Nahal is, we've got some Hebrew students in here. What's Nahal mean? It's a river.
Yeah.
So the Lachish River. So Nahal Lachish, the river of Lachish. It's kind of an obvious name for the river, right? Okay, so here you can see in this picture, you can see the river winding around here. Coming around. And here's Tel in the middle here, surrounded on three sides. So this is a good place to have a city. You've got abundant water available for you. And that's usually there are 3 or 4 things that define the location of a city. One is the availability of water. A second, of course, is that it's defensible from enemies. And then a third would be some other source of natural resources. Okay, so there might be mining, there could be trees, there could be pasture land, there could be, something suitable for farming, something like that. But these are the things then that define where you're going to find a city. And this has just about everything imaginable. It's up on a raised area because it's a tell, so it's easily defensible. The river on 3 sides, you've got water. There's obviously, you can see around here, this is a modern day picture, but you can see all the farming that's going on there even today. It's got rich, abundant farmland. 31 acres to this tell. That's a pretty good site, pretty good sized city for ancient times. It was excavated by Starkey in 1932 to 1938. Again, a second time by Ahroni in 66 to 68, and then most recently by Usishkin in 73 through 87. These are various archaeologists that have worked on this site, and it's been excavated pretty extensively. Okay, so on your review questions, you are asked, when was Lachish first settled? Look at how old this is. First settled about 3000 BC. So this is pre-Abrahamic. Pre-Abrahamic. This is an old city. And it has a very long and established history. From 1500 BC, it was an unfortified Canaanite city, which was destroyed in 1200 BC. It was rebuilt as an Amorite city under the control of Egypt. And then it was conquered by Joshua, Joshua chapter 10. Eventually it was destroyed, perhaps by the Israelites, about 1130 BC. So that's what we know about the old city of Lachish. But notice point number 6. In the 9th century, a new walled city was built, probably by King Rehoboam. Okay, Rehoboam was Solomon's successor. Rehoboam was really the man that was responsible for splitting Israel into 2 kingdoms, northern and southern. He promised to be harsher than his father David and to raise taxes. And so those people said, no, we don't want higher taxes. And so they rebelled. Amaziah took refuge in this city and was killed there when fleeing from rebels in Jerusalem, according to 2 Kings 14. In the early 8th century, the city was damaged by an earthquake, and that's recorded in Amos and again in Zechariah. And then it was subsequently rebuilt. Now notice this, and this is an answer to one of the review questions on the quiz. In 701 BC, Sennacherib laid siege to the city and captured it. The siege was depicted on a relief sculpture in Sennacherib's palace, now on display in the British Museum. And you can actually see a picture of you carved in this relief of the archers and the soldiers, the chariots. It's quite an interesting picture. I'm sure you can Google it and find pictures of it. Eventually, the Assyrians razed the city. So this is what Hezekiah feared so much from the Assyrians, and why he dug the tunnel to bring water into Jerusalem. So the Assyrians were not able to defeat Jerusalem, but they did conquer Lachish to the south. And Lachish was a very important city in the kingdom of Judah at the time. So in the post-exilic era, then, it was resettled by returning Israelites. Oh, point E, just above that, 586, it was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then it was rebuilt in the post-exilic era as they came back from Babylonian captivity. Persian and Hellenistic walls were built, and then later the site was abandoned. But it has an interesting history, and it gives us another kind of taste for the Shephelah and this area with the gently rolling hills and nice valleys with farming. Okay, now I want to go down to the coast, to the Mediterranean coast, and think about the city of Ashkelon, for a few minutes. So as we said at the beginning of our class this evening, before the break, Ashkelon was the northernmost of the Philistine Pentapolis. So Ashkelon today is an Israelite city and has a very, very interesting and rich history. Here are some other pictures of Lachish just before we go to Ashkelon. There's a foundation of the governor's residence that stood shortly before the destruction by the Babylonians. This is the largest Iron Age structure known in Israel. And then here is Ashkelon. Now we're down by the Mediterranean coast. And here's the beach at Ashkelon. And I want you to notice what we have in our notes in our booklet. Located on the southern Mediterranean coast between Jaffa and Gaza. So in recent days, the last few years, Ashkelon has several times come under the threat of rockets being fired from the Gaza Strip. And so the inhabitants have had to go into their bomb shelters. So I'm saying we're going to visit Ashkelon, assuming everything is peaceful at the time, and it probably is. Most of the time it is. It's not a problem. But we always have on our tour excellent communication with people. Our tour guide is in constant communication with people who are ahead. And if there's ever any danger of any kind, we always just go somewhere else. Always. We've never really had to. I think maybe once in all the years I've been going there, we have to make any change of plans. So it just almost never happens. But we're always in good communication. We're always completely safe. And Ashkelon really is not that close to the Gaza Strip that you should normally have any worries. Okay, so Ashkelon. Point number 2. From the 19th to the 15th centuries, this is BC, it is known in Egyptian texts. So we know about this city from extra-biblical texts coming out of ancient Egypt. Remember we talked about the Via Maris. The Via Maris was that way by the sea, via, way, or road, Maris, Latin for sea. The Via Maris coming from the north then through Israel alongside the seacoast. So that became a major thoroughfare for the Egyptians to push northward into the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan. And at various times, the Egyptians controlled many major cities. So earlier in this series, when we talked about Bet Shean, for example, we talked about the Egyptians' control of Bet Shean. That's way up in the Jezreel Valley, in that passageway between the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan Valley, Bet Shean. Ashkelon, much further south, and the Egyptians were active here at various times. They had commerce going on with Ashkelon. Ashkelon has kind of a seaport. It's not a real good place for a seaport because most of the coastline of Israel is very smooth. But you can make a breakwater and have a place for boats to dock and do some business there. And so this is why it was an important, trade city. Point number 3, and this is an answer to question number 7. What people lived in Ashkelon in the Old Testament? And the answer is in the 12th century it became a Philistine city. So this is what we read about in the Old Testament. We read about the Philistine peoples living there. Who were the Philistines? What do we know about the Philistines? Where did they come from? Were they local people? Did they start out here, or did they come in from some other region? They were sailors, yeah. They were sailors who came in. They were called the Sea People. And they were known in the ancient Egyptian texts as the Sea People. They came in and invaded Egypt. They didn't conquer it, but they settled there. They also settled up in the land of Canaan, especially in this region. So the Philistines, we think they came from the Greek Isles originally. So this is part of the irony of the Arab people who live in the land calling themselves Palestinians, and they try to identify themselves with the Philistines. It's kind of a grasping at straws. They're trying to say, well, we have this ancient claim because this is the land that was ours when we were Philistines. But the Philistines were probably people from the Greek Isles, whereas the people calling themselves Palestinians today are of Arab origin. But who cares about history, right? as long as you've got a political point to make. Okay. Number 4, Samson killed 30 men to repay his part of the vow of the riddle in Judges 14, verse 19. So Samson, of course, is constantly having these interactions with the Philistines. And so this contest continues on and on. And in the recent past few years, you know, out of Gaza has been this, one of the things that the Palestinians have been doing the last couple of years is flying these incendiary kites from Gaza into Israel. Have you read about any of that? They burned up thousands upon thousands of acres of farmland in Israel by sending these incendiary kites across the border. And one take on this is that this is the chance that Philistines have to take vengeance on Samson for having tied the foxes' tails together, putting a torch in them, and burning up the Philistines' farmland. That's the way it was explained just a few months ago in an article I read. So it's quite interesting. But Samson, yeah, he's interacting with people of Ashkelon. 598 BC, it was destroyed by Babylon. In the Hellenistic period, okay, this is the Greek period, the Hellenistic period is New Testament era now, this became an important seaport. And I mentioned the fact there is not a natural harbor, but you have to make a man-made harbor. You have to extend a sea break, building up usually with stones out into the water, and then you can bring ships in. Now, point number 7 is the answer to review question number 8. What famous individual from the early New Testament era was born at Ashkelon? And the answer is Herod the Great. And this is interesting because what was Herod's nationality? What was it? Edom. He was an Edomite. He's called an Idumean. So Idumean is just a corruption of the word Edomite. So his parents were from Edom, okay, east of the Jordan River. But they had moved to Ashkelon, and that was where Herod was born. So Herod actually grew up in this area of Israel in New Testament times as part of Judea. And this is where he learns about Israel, learns about the Jews, and he eventually falls in love with this Jewish girl, Miriam. He wants to convert to Judaism. He's never accepted by the Jews. But he has such a strong desire to be loved and appreciated by the Jews that he carries out all these building programs all throughout the land. And he wants the Jews to love him, but at the same time, he was a cruel tyrant. And he was, you know, he probably came from a dysfunctional family, we'd say today. And he was very dysfunctional himself. He was paranoid of his own sons, had many of them put to death. He was just a madman. He's crazy. But he was also brilliant. So here he is. This is the man, Herod the Great, and he was born there, and he later rebuilt the city. In the Byzantine period, okay, Christian Rome, 4th century onward, the Jews were the only minority group allowed freedom to practice their religion. So the Byzantines exercised very tight religious control over their empire. Christianity was the established religion of the Byzantine Empire. But they said, the Jews, you can practice Judaism. You have a license to do that. In some regions of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines had very friendly relations with the Jews. Now, that wasn't universal throughout the entire Byzantine Empire. There were other times where the Byzantines were anti-Semitic. They persecuted the Jews and treated them harshly. But there were some places and times in the Byzantine Empire where there were very good relations between Jews and Christians. They worked side by side. In some cases, they formed partnerships in business. Later on, in the Middle Ages, around 1000, a different Christian group will come in and control the land. These are the Crusaders. And the Crusaders were never favorably inclined towards the Jews. They were exceedingly anti-Semitic. So you always have to consider all sides of a story. Okay, we generally tend to hear a skewed story of history. It all kind of depends on whose history you're reading. So if you're reading a history of the United States of America from a British perspective, it's going to sound a lot different than one written from an American's perspective, right? So if you read about the Crusades, when I was a little guy, we heard about the Crusades, and the Crusaders were these great heroes. Now you read about the Crusaders, and they were these terrible people that went in and killed and maimed people. It's just two different sides of the story. Okay, why were the Crusades fought? The Crusades were fought because the Muslims had moved in and had taken control of the Holy Land. And Christian pilgrims that were coming into Israel to visit the Holy Land were being pestered and persecuted and mistreated by the Arabs that were in control. So they started taking with them armed guards for protection. And this eventually grew into what we know of as the Crusades, which were armed forces, armies raised up by the Catholic Church to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims. Now, were they justified in doing that? Well, in some ways, you could say yes, they were. But they went to excess, and they were cruel. And many of the Crusades, before they even set out from Europe, practiced their warfare on local Jewish villages in Europe and carried out what were known as the pogroms against the Jews. The Crusaders were not kind towards the Jews. They were strongly anti-Semitic for the most part. And so while they wanted to drive out the Arabs, they also didn't think the Jews should have any right to the land of Israel. So there's more than one side to a very complex story when it comes to the Crusaders. But backing up again to the earlier 4th century on Byzantine Christians, compared with the Crusaders, much more friendly towards the Jews, okay, but still not perfect. So when you hear or read of history, try to make sure that you get all sides of the stories. Don't just read it from one perspective. Try to get a good, complete picture. Okay. In 1153, speaking of the Crusaders built a strong stone wall at Ashkelon. And in 1270, it was destroyed by the Arabs and then abandoned until 1948 and the creation of the modern state of Israel. So those are the details about Ashkelon. Here is a picture of Ashkelon. And as we move on, this is again, this is down alongside the Tell over on the left. And you can see the Mediterranean out in front of you. This would be the city, the ancient city on the left. Middle Bronze period, Canaanite gate constructed of mud bricks. Outside the gate, a bronze calf was discovered, apparently once worshipped at the city entrance. Okay. All right, that's Ashkelon. And the Lord willing, we'll get a chance to visit Ashkelon. There's a very nice park in Ashkelon, by the way. The last city that we want to talk about, I think it's the last, yeah, is Beersheba. Okay, so Dan to Beersheba, down in the south, down in the Arava, the southern region of Israel. This is desert country. And most of the time, it looks very barren, very desert-like. In this picture, you can see a little bit of greenery. Actually, last year when we were in Beersheba, there was quite a bit of greenery. There had been some recent rains, and the grasses and wildflowers had sprung up, and it was really quite nice looking. And the Beersheba River runs just outside of this tell, and it may not always have water in it, but if it rains, it will have water. The word Be'er Sheva, Be'er is a well. Sheva is an oath. So it's the well of the oath. Be'er Sheva. Usually that's, if you slow it down, it sounds like that. Be'er, two consonants, or two syllables. Be'er Sheva. But usually it's all run together. Be'er Sheva. I remember on the first visit that I went to Israel, and there was a group of pastors. It was all pastors. And when we went down to Beersheba, our tour guide was talking about Beersheba, and this one guy said, well, we call it Beersheba. I thought, would you please be quiet? But anyway, lots of place names. We do our best to try to pronounce them, but these are, for the most part, Hebrew, sometimes Greek names, and they have a proper pronunciation. And it's good to try to pronounce things properly. Here's an aerial view of the tell. Again, typical kind of tell with the sloping sides, flat top. It's been excavated now, and you can see the buildings, the ancient buildings that were there. We'll get to go up onto this tell and look all around in many of these buildings. There's a nice tower right here in the center that you can climb up onto and have a good look all around this tell. It's quite something. Here is a typical four-room Israelite house from the Iron Age. This kind of architectural structure seems to have been somewhat unique to Israelite dwellings. So other cultures have their ways of building, but the typical Israelite house is called a four-room house, and it is very simple, but basically three walls with then a division in the back with a doorway. That's room one. And then a couple of divisions like this, making 1, 2, 3 other rooms. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this one is a little bit different in that it has this one across the back, and then it's got 2 and 3, and then a fourth room up here in the front. That's a little bit of an alteration from the typical four-room house that's found in Israelite dwellings. But it changed a little bit, but the same basic structure is noted. Sometimes there were only 3 rooms instead of 4, but they still call it a four-room construction. Okay, probably in one of the front ones, typically that center one in the front is where you would keep your animals, and the sides might be storage, and in the back for living. Various types of uses of these four-room houses. Discovered at Beersheba was a nice four-horned altar. Now, this has been reconstructed. The stones had been put to secondary usage and were built into a wall. But those stones that have been taken out and reconstructed, and you read about the horns of an altar in the Bible. This is the type of thing that you find here. So this was so that you could, if you needed to, you could tie an animal down while it was being slaughtered. So, but if you ever wondered what an altar looked like, here's a small altar that was found there at Beersheba.
So it looked like it was made out of cut stone.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
It was, yeah. So, yeah. So the altar for the temple, of course, was to be of uncut stones, wasn't it? But this was probably a pagan altar. This one. It might be Israelite. We don't know. There are lots of different people who lived here at different times. When you look at your notebook, let's talk about Beersheba a little bit. I'll just put this back onto this nice picture of the tell. So we are now about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Roughly halfway between the Mediterranean and the southern part of the Dead Sea. Now, when we first arrive in Israel, first we'll fly into Tel Aviv, or just outside of Tel Aviv, but then we'll go by bus over to the Dead Sea. It'll be the southern end of the Dead Sea. From the Dead Sea on our tour, after we're done down there, we're going to go northward. But if we were to head west, straight west, we would end up at Beersheba. Now, we'll end up at Beersheba near the end of our tour. We're going to go north, we're going to turn south, come down to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem one day we'll head out and go to Beersheba and back. It'll be a day trip, okay? And you'll get a good chance as we travel from Jerusalem south to Beersheba to go through the Shvela. That's when we'll visit the Valley of Elah that we've just been talking about. We'll get to see Bet Shemesh down through that area, and we'll go down to Beersheba. On that day, we'll also probably stop at Ashkelon on the way, and then we'll come back up through, and I'm not sure exactly which route we'll take back through going north. If we take the eastern route, we can actually go up through Arad and up alongside of Hebron, and then back up to Jerusalem. Anyway, located about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem, just west of the southern part of the Dead Sea. Number two, situated about 900 feet above sea level at a point where four wadis or riverbeds come together. Remember, a wadi, that's the Arabic name for an intermittent stream. So this is a seasonal stream. It fills up with water when it rains, but during the dry part of the year, it's dry. So a dry riverbed that can fill up with water. Four of them converge together at this point. So we're down in the desert. Where do you want a city? You want a city where you can get water. Where are you going to find water? Well, where four wadis come together, anytime it rains, there's going to be water there. So you can do like they did down at Qumran, and you can build cisterns for the collection of the water. But the water also is going to seep down into the ground and become part of the water table. So you can also dig a well. And what do we read that the patriarchs were busy doing? They were digging wells. And it was down in this area of the country. When we're at Beersheba, we'll be able to see the water system there. And there's both a well there, but there's also a very extensive water system that has like a tunnel going down through it. Okay, so four riverbeds come to, here are the names of them: the Besor, the Gerar, the Hebron, and the Beersheba. So Hebron, for Hebron, the city of Hebron, so obviously it originates up there and flows all the way down to here. The Beersheba, named for Beersheba, and then there are two other wadis here, Besor and Gerar. There's evidence of settlement noticed during the Chalcolithic period. So Chalcolithic, that's before the Bronze Age. This is very, very early. From a biblical perspective, we're probably talking about the period shortly after Noah's flood. Okay, Chalcolithic is copper stone. Chalcos means copper, and lithos is stone. Chalcolithic. We're not yet even in the Bronze Age. We're coming out of the Stone Age into the Copper Age, Chalcolithic. So this has a very, very early known settlement. Now, the biblical significance of Beersheba, and this is in the answer to one of the questions here, question number 9 on the review sheet asks which Jewish patriarch or patriarchs is associated or are associated with Beersheba. So notice at the bottom of page 29, this is the site of Abraham's well, and hence the name Be'er Shava, the well of the oath. This is where Abraham took the oath, Genesis 21, 22 to 32. Top of page 30, this is the possible site of Isaac's birth. So what patriarchs are associated with this site? Well, Abraham is, so is Isaac. Isaac is born there. Genesis 21, verses 1 through 5. Hagar and Ishmael went out into the wilderness from Beersheba. And D, it is the site of Isaac's well and altar. So even if Isaac wasn't born there, he dug a well there and he built an altar there. So Isaac is definitely associated with Beersheba, Abraham and Isaac. Look at point E. This is the home of Jacob in Genesis 28:10. So all three of the patriarchs of Israel are associated with Beersheba. This is why it's known as the city of the patriarchs. Initially, when Israel conquered the land under Joshua, this was given to the tribe of Judah. Okay, so Judah has the southernmost portion of the land. So it's easy to remember that Judah has Beersheba. Samuel's two sons served as judges at Beersheba. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 2. And they weren't very good judges either. H, it is frequently mentioned as the southern extent of inhabited Israel, an expression from Dan to Beersheba. Look at all the references for this expression. Judges 20, verse 1, 1 Samuel 3, verse 20, 2 Samuel 3:10, 17:11, 24:2, 15, 1 Kings 4:24 to 25, 1 Chronicles 21:2, 2 Chronicles 35. Dan in the north, Beersheba in the south. So again, this was not the southern boundary for Israel. That went all the way down to the river of Egypt. But it was the southernmost habitable place in Israel. South of Beersheba, you're in desert. And nobody really has a city there. There are some nomads dwelling there. There's some people traveling around with their flocks. And there are caravans getting from point A to point B, traversing that region. But Beersheba is about as far south as you want to go. From there on, it's pretty rough going. Now, there is a modern city of Beersheba. It's not located at the Tel. It's just a little ways away from the Tel. And it's a modern city. It's a large city. There is a major university in the modern city of Beersheba. There's a nice shopping mall there. And there are a number of things we can say about it. It was located several miles from the Tel. B, it was built in the year 1900, initially as a Turkish army regional headquarters. And it was called Beit Eshel, okay, built by Jews. C, in Israel's War for Independence, 1948, it was initially captured by Egypt. Later, it was recaptured by the Israelis. And they raised a hastily made, handmade Israeli flag. Okay. There's an interesting story that goes along with the raising of the Israeli flag at Beersheba. Today, it's the capital of the Negev. This is, by the way, question number 10 on your review sheet. Of which region is Beersheba now the capital? So there are regions in Israel. And the southernmost region is called the Negev. And this is the capital, not of the country, but the capital of that region. So it'd be kind of like a county, I guess. They don't call them counties, but this would be like a county seat. With a population of 120,000. That number is outdated. This is several years old. I'm not sure what the population is today. Okay, Hallie, you'll have to Google it for us. And here's an interesting little bit of trivia. Every Thursday, it hosts the weekly Bedouin market and camel auction. So if you want to buy a camel, this is the place to go on Thursday. Okay. So we'll see a number of camels while we're there. On our first full day of touring, we'll actually go on a camel trek out in the Negev, 30, 45 minutes, and not too much, just enough to get yourself good and saddle sore. And that's about all you want to ride on a camel, but that's kind of fun. We'll also see camels in lots of other places around Israel, but they're very interesting animals. Lots of camels, lots of donkeys, lots of goats, sheep. These are the most common animals that we'll see. They do raise cattle in Israel also, but not nearly as much as goats and sheep. Goats and sheep are the animals that they really have a lot of. So, are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, it's over 200,000.
Okay, over 200,000.
Okay. Are we going to get to go to Jacob's Well?
Okay, good question. Jacob's Well now is north of Jerusalem. It's in the region called Samaria, and it is part of what's called the West Bank. And it's a part of the West Bank where a Jewish Israeli tour guide is not lawfully able to take us. And so we will not be going to Jacob's Well.
Okay.
Someday I'd like to go there. I'd like to see it. The closest we'll get to that part, interestingly, is going to be Nevi Samuel. Nevi Samuel is just a little bit north of Jerusalem. Nevi is the Arabic word for prophet. Okay, so Navi in Hebrew, Nebi in Arabic, prophet. Nevi Samuel, the prophet Samuel. And this is the reported burial place of Samuel in the Bible. And there is a very interesting building at Nevi Samuel. It's 2 stories tall. Downstairs there's a Jewish synagogue. Upstairs there's a Muslim mosque. But the reason we like to go there is because from the rooftop, it's got a flat roof, and you can get up on the rooftop, you have a wonderful view of the land of Israel. Now, Nevi Samuel is just a little ways south of Bethel. From Bethel, Abraham was told, lift up your eyes and look north, south, east, and west. All the land that you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants. So Bethel is not too far from Jacob's Well, and we can't go there either. But from Nevi Samuel, we're in territory that looks very much like the territory around Jacob's Well and Bethel, and it's roughly the same kind of geographical location. So, so that's a roundabout, kind of complicated way of answering your question. The short, quick, easy answer is no. We won't go there. There's a good reason why we're not going there. At Jacob's Well, you also have Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. So when the Jews entered into the promised land under Joshua, there were the cursings and the blessings, and those are pronounced from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Where these two come together, there's a valley. This is where Jacob's Well is located. And on Mount Gerizim today is the main location for a group of people known as the Samaritans. Now, we encounter the Samaritans in the Bible. If you've studied about the Samaritans at all, you very likely have heard it said the Samaritans were Gentiles that were brought in and they learned the ways of the Jews. But this is not what the Samaritans say about themselves. The Samaritans say about themselves that they are the leftovers from the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh, that when the Assyrians deported the Jews, these were the people who stayed in the land, and they protected the holy site of God. The Samaritans say that when David conquered Jerusalem and made that the capital of Israel, he was acting against the will of God. They said that the place that God has chosen for the temple was on Mount Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing. And so the name Samaritan, most people would naturally think that they took their name from the city, Samaria. Okay, Samaritans are from Samaria. But they're actually from Mount Gerizim, which is not in Samaria. And the name Samaritan is from the Hebrew word shamar. Shamar means, any Hebrew scholars here? To guard, that's right. So the Samaritans say, we are the guardians of the holy place. They said God wanted his temple to be built on the Mount of Blessing. And they actually had a temple there in the intertestamental period. The Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim was destroyed by the Hasmoneans, whom we've talked about even this evening. In Jesus' day, the Samaritan temple did not stand, but he met the woman at Jacob's Well, the woman at the well. And as they were carrying on this conversation, the woman said to Jesus, you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where we should worship, but we say that in this mountain is the place. That's this conflict that we're talking about. The Samaritans believed that Mount Gerizim was the place where God should be worshipped. Now, Jesus' reply was interesting. He said, the hour is coming, and now is, when neither in Jerusalem nor in this mountain will men worship the Father, but you will worship him in spirit and in truth. Because the New Testament teaching is that the worship of God is not tied to a physical location. And Jesus was describing, actually, very clearly, New Testament, what we would call church truth. Now, there's coming a time where worship will once again be located in Jerusalem. The second coming of Christ, he will establish the capital of the world in the kingdom in Jerusalem, and there will be a millennial temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel describes that temple in great detail. And Zechariah says that 10 Gentiles will come to Jerusalem, take hold of the robe of one who's called a Jew, and ask that Jew to teach him how to worship God in Jerusalem. So we are living in this unique period of time between the Old Testament dispensation when worship was tied to a physical location. If you were a Samaritan, you said it was Gerizim. If you were a Jew, you said it was Jerusalem. That has come to an end because things have changed. Because we have the creation of the church on the day of Pentecost, a new entity. We are not the true Israel of God. We are simply the church, the body of Christ. And Israel was the people of God under the dispensation of Moses. And the people of Israel will once again become God's representatives in the world, beginning in the tribulation period when God chooses 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Those tribes are named in the book of Revelation chapter 7. So, but Jesus was talking about what would be true during our period of time. It's been almost 2,000 years, where there is not a holy place, there's not a location. Now, some groups of Christians have misunderstood this truth. And so there's a whole doctrine, a Roman Catholic doctrine, about the importance of holy places. In the Catholic Church, part of salvation has to do with doing penance. And there are different ways you can do penance. I mean, one of the simplest ways is simply by repeating so many Hail Marys, using rosary beads, and so forth. Or you might be, the priest might tell you to do something, one thing or another thing. You can purchase, through actual payment of money, indulgences for forgiveness of sins. And this goes back to the Middle Ages. But one of the things that's built into the whole Roman Catholic system of penance is visiting holy places. I mentioned earlier the practice in the Middle Ages that led to the Crusades. You had these Christian pilgrims that were traveling to the Holy Land. Why is this? Oftentimes because they were fulfilling some vow they had made to a priest that in order for forgiveness of sins, they had to visit a holy place and say certain prayers at a holy place. And the belief was that if you visit a site that is named in the Bible or is associated with somebody who is a saint, that site is particularly holy and your prayers will be more efficacious. This is the background to the whole idea of pilgrimage. So when we visit Israel, sometimes people will say, oh, you're going on pilgrimage. Hey, I always say, no, this is not a pilgrimage. Because I know what that means. Now, most people don't know all that. And they don't really mean that. They just mean you're going on a visit to the Holy Land. It's a pilgrimage. First time I went to Israel, we were actually presented by the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek at the time, a nice little scroll commemorating our pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And I still have that somewhere in a file. I don't display that one on the wall because I just don't want to be associated with that kind of misunderstanding about the efficacy of works. The Bible says we're saved by grace through faith and not of ourselves, not of works, lest any man should boast. So when we go to Israel, and this is one of the things that distinguishes the kind of tour that we're taking from other religious tours, we're not going to visit holy sites to get closer to God by being at these sites. We're going to become informed about the Bible so that we can understand our Bible. It's in the Bible that we meet with God. It's in the Bible that we're reading God's words. It's in the Bible that we read words that are inspired by God. But being in the land gives us a better ability to understand the Bible. Now, I'm telling you this in words, but I'll also tell you that when you are in the land of Israel, it is an awesome experience, and there's nothing like it. And you may feel closer to God because you're there. It's not because there's any kind of magical force tied to these locations. That's really more of a pagan idea than it is a biblical idea. But you become more aware of what the Bible is talking about. And it makes, I think, a deeper impression on your heart and mind than just, reading about it in the Bible or reading about it in a book or a Bible dictionary or something like that. There is something really, really interesting about visiting the Holy Land. But it's not meritorious. I want to make sure you understand that. There is a phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon they talk about called the Jerusalem Syndrome. And it happens every year. There are people that are affected by this Jerusalem Syndrome. And the psychological impact of being in the Holy Land is so overwhelming to some people, they kind of lose their mind. And there's always somebody, they dress themselves up in a robe from their hotel, and they go out in the desert, and they start prophesying and thinking they're a mouthpiece for God. And it actually has this name. The psychologists call it the Jerusalem Syndrome. I want to forewarn you that the emotional impact of being there can be kind of overwhelming. I mean, it is kind of awesome to think, here I am, I'm walking where Jesus walked, I'm looking at these same walls that Abraham saw and looked at. I'm walking and experiencing things that I've read about in the Bible all my life. And it can be amazing. And it's okay to be amazed. It's okay to let yourself be impressed, but don't let yourself be overtaken to the point that we had I've never had anybody who really went that far on any of our tours. I always forewarn everybody about the Jerusalem Syndrome because I'm afraid that one of my tours is going to do that and embarrass me. So I always make sure everybody knows about it. We had one lady I think came close one year. And she was just walking around in a daze the whole time. And I think she was lost in this fog. And I was worried about her, to be honest with you. But she never went over the edge. Oh, how did we get on that topic? Somebody asked a question that I was answering. Anyway.
No, about the well.
Yeah, but we are going to be going to.
Oh, the well, yeah.
Maybe Isaac's and Abraham's well.
Okay, so we'll be down at Beersheba, and we'll see wells there. Whether those are the actual ones dug by Abraham and Isaac, good question. We will see a water system that was no doubt accessed by Abraham. Yeah. And we will see the actual city. I mean, this is a tell. It's excavated. It has remains going back to Israelite times at various levels. The lower you get, the older you get. So certainly some from Abraham's time, some from later Israelite times. Yeah, good question. But Jacob's Well is West Bank. It's I was going to say this about Gerizim also, and about this area. The tomb of Joseph is there also by Jacob's Well. And remember when Joseph was dying, he told his brothers to make sure that they brought his bones back to Israel. And they did, and his burial site is there at Mount Gerizim. And so at the tomb of Joseph, there is a synagogue. So I forget when, maybe 15, 20 years ago, something like this. Maybe not quite that long ago. Now that it's West Bank, Arab controlled under Palestinian Authority, the Palestinians basically took over the synagogue and turned it into a mosque. Well, this caused a big problem with the nation of Israel. And so they had very delicate negotiations that were going on between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. And they finally have worked out an agreement that allows Jews to go back there and say their prayers at the tomb of Joseph, but it's still under the control of the Palestinians. And when Jews go, they have to carefully coordinate their visit with the Israeli military. They have to go with a military escort only at prescribed times. And then they can go there, they can go into the old synagogue, which has been turned now into a mosque, and they can pray there, and they can conduct their service, and then they have to hightail it out of there and get back to their own territory. This is, these are the complications with some of the West Bank areas. Hebron, same thing. Very difficult. We used to be able to go into Hebron with no problem. Now, with a Jewish Israeli tour guide, probably not. The last time we went, I think I mentioned our tour guide's wife had to undergo emergency surgery. The touring company had to shuffle around and hurriedly try to get us a different tour guide. We actually shared 3 different tour guides on the last trip. But the one we had, the 2 of them were Jewish women. But the other one was a man who was actually descended from the Crusaders. So his forebears from Italy had come on crusade and had stayed there and had been in the Holy Land for generation after generation after generation since around 1000 AD. He's not Jewish. He has Israeli citizenship, but he's not a Jew, and so he can go anywhere he wants. So we got to go back into Hebron last time. Now, I'm not guaranteeing we'll be able to. We probably won't. But that was interesting. I had been to Hebron in earlier days before all the complications with the Palestinian Authority rose up, and then we hadn't been able to go for many, many years. So that was a real treat last time. But our tour guide Malcolm always has something new that I've never seen before. Every time I've gone, I've used Malcolm time and time and time again, and he's never failed to show me something new that I haven't seen before. There's no end of stuff to see. I talked about maybe the possibility of having to make a change in our itinerary. If that happens, it's no worry, it's no trouble. There's just always something else you can go see. So if, let's say, worst case scenario, and there's like 1% chance this might happen. Let's suppose Ashkelon is threatened by a rocket attack. No problem, we just go somewhere else. And we see something else that's fascinating and interesting, something where it's safe. So, yeah, that's the way it is in Israel. I've been going back to Israel year after year after year, and I hate to think of how many things there are in Israel that I haven't seen. One of these days, what I wish I could do, well, my dream is to have a Shasta Bible College extension in Israel. Find a building there and just go over there and teach. It would be wonderful. And then we could take as much time as we want to go out and tour and visit all the places and see everything there is to see.
Are you going to build this building?
Well, I'm not going to dig down into the Israeli ground because it'll never get built. So I did have a friend, an alumnus of Shasta Bible College, went over there and studied for several years. I'm not talking about Tom, but another fellow who was actually in school here when I was. And he lived there for for many years. He's back in the United States now. But I told him, I said, look, I would love to have a school there. Would you keep your eyes open for a building that would be cheap to rent? And he kept his eyes open. He never did find anything. Rent is very expensive, especially in Jerusalem. But actually, if I had my choice, I'd probably like to pick something up in Galilee. It's very, very wonderful and beautiful up there. There's The Master's College started actually back when it was Los Angeles Baptist College, operating the school out of a kibbutz on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it's still operating today. I know the professor who teaches over there and is in charge of that. But that would be a wonderful place to be. Sea of Galilee is so peaceful and beautiful and wonderful. It's green up there, and then things are cheaper too. But to be located on a kibbutz is kind of a neat thing. The students that go and study there then do volunteer work on the kibbutz, on their farm. And then they also go to school taught by Master's Seminary. And that would be my dream. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but maybe in the millennium I'll get to do that. Okay. Folks, we have one more class before we depart for Jerusalem, for Israel, and that will be next Friday night. And then the following week, Friday night, will be just before we take off. So we won't meet here that night. Next week, we'll talk about some more things, but we'll talk about traveling, especially, and we'll also be making some plans for meeting, when to meet, where to meet, how to meet, get together at the airport and all of that. Talk about some guidelines for traveling and sticking together and how to conduct ourselves. Any questions you have, be sure you bring them next week, and we'll try to answer any questions that you have. But if there are no other questions right now, we're a little bit early, but we'll go ahead and quit. Are there any questions? Okay, well, it's been a fun night. We've got to see some interesting little video clips along with our lecture, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. By the way, let me remind you, pray for Clint and his daughter. They're still waiting on their passports. Okay, so they signed up on the tour. They didn't have passports. They've requested expedited service, but you know, that's a little bit of a white knuckle moment here as you're waiting on those passports. But I'm sure they'll come through. But if we're all praying for them, then we know things will be right. Okay? Okay, we're dismissed.
Second.